question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. Mr Kevin Brennan.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I rise to oppose the 10-minute rule motion from the honourable member for Croydon South. And I do so because this bill is disproportionate, it's unnecessary, and it's an attack on a fundamental British liberty, the right to withdraw labour in a legal trade dispute with an employer. And it's not as if we haven't already experienced a full frontal attack on the rights of workers who are in dispute with their employer under this government already, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I draw attention of the House to yesterday's order paper on page 34, which I'm sure honourable members have read, the remaining orders and notices, and the part where it says, and I quote, "Business in this section has not yet been scheduled for a specific date. It's therefore been set down formally to be taken in the chamber today, but it's not expected to be taken in the chamber today." So what could this business be? Point number 3, trade unions from Secretary Greg Clark about political funds. Point number 4, trade unions from Secretary Greg Clark about public service transport regulations. Point number 5, trade unions that draft important public services fire regulations. Point number 6, you've got it, trade unions, the public services border security regulations. Point number 7, trade unions, the important public services education regulations. Point number 8, trade unions, public service health regulations 2017. Madam Deputy Speaker, the honourable gentleman in his bill this afternoon is seeking to restrict the rights of people in the workplace even further before the government has even brought into force its last full frontal attack on workers. And to be perfectly honest, we all know that if this bill were allowed to proceed, it would simply be the thin end of the wedge for even more anti-trade union legislation from the Conservatives, because this is what they do when they're in power. Madam Deputy Speaker, dogs bark, birds fly, and Tories attack workers' rights.
That's right.
And in the press, the honourable member for Croydon South has framed his 10-minute rule bill specifically as a response to the dispute, as he did today, with Southern Rail. But of course it goes much further than that, Madam Deputy Speaker, to include transport in general, to include the National Health Service, to include fire, to include ambulance services. This isn't about one industrial dispute. Whatever the rights and wrongs may be of that particular dispute, it's about further restricting the long fought-for right of workers in a free society to withhold their labour. He talks about disproportionate industrial action. It's important to bear in mind what the proportions really are. There were 106 strikes in the last year that we have the figures for in 2015, an eighth of the number of strikes that there were in 1985. That means a loss of 0.003% of all working days that year. 81,000 workers went on strike. That's the lowest level since records began in 1893. And let's look at the type of so-called disproportionate action that occurs in the industries the honourable gentleman has highlighted. One of the most widely covered strikes this year and last year was that of British Airways workers, who have taken a total of 5 days of action to protest their poverty-level pay. And for those workers, that's a real hardship and sacrifice, because on average, mixed fleet cabin crew, a category specifically introduced to deliberately create second-class workers in that particular company, earn £16,000 a year, including allowances, whilst Willie Walsh, the boss of their parent company, pocketed £6.5 million. That, Madam Deputy Speaker, is the very definition of disproportionate. Industrial action is already highly regulated, especially in the light of the execrable Trade Union Act 2016, the regulations for which I mentioned earlier and which have not yet actually been brought into force. In that Act, the government created specific strike thresholds for important public services. 50% of union membership must vote. 40% of those who are entitled to vote must be in favour of the industrial action for a strike to be legal. But even that's not good enough for the honourable member. This bill would put the decision about whether workers can withdraw their labour into the hands of a High Court judge. Ironically, one group of workers, Madam Deputy Speaker, whose pensions the government are unable to touch. I would have thought, in the light of today's events, that the other side might be a bit more wary about handing over decisions to judges, but that's a totally other matter. This proposal is also insidious, because it's coming from the same party that's picking the pension pockets of nuclear workers in places like Sellafield. The government's latest raid on the pensions of nuclear workers will adversely affect communities like Copeland, where a large number of nuclear workers live. At the time of privatisation, promises were made to ensure the protection of their pensions. During the committee stage of the Enterprise Bill, Madam Deputy Speaker, I put down amendments to ensure that workers in this sector would be exempt from the public sector redundancy cap. The government refused to support those amendments, and now the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority has announced its intentions to save the Treasury a reported £660 million from these workers, despite the promises that were made when the industry was privatised. And it won't miss the attention of the workers of Sellafield and indeed the voters of Copeland that the Conservatives are seeking to make it more difficult to take action in specified industries whilst robbing them of their promised pensions. And where was this concern for ending industrial disputes when the government promised to bankroll Southern in this dispute using taxpayers' money? Because the government has inserted clauses into franchise agreements, meaning that any losses accrued by the rail company in the event of industrial action can be compensated by the government using taxpayers' funds, removing any incentive for the company to come to the table. Where was this concern for consumer access to our critical national services when the Prime Minister dismissed the humanitarian crisis in our hospitals as overblown? The real problem facing our National Health Service is not a handful of days of doctors' strikes, but this government's policy of systemic and constant underfunding, understaffing and overworking. Where was this concern for consumer access to our critical national services when the New Year saw train fare prices rise again? While Labour protested against the price hikes, there was no 10-minute rule bill from the honourable member about the people's right to a reasonable fare to travel to work. But there is another way, Madam Deputy Speaker, to deal with industrial relations. The Labour government in Wales has tabled its own trade union bill recently. That's a government that understands that workers are not an enemy within, to be isolated and vilified. They're themselves consumers who contribute to the economy and are members of the community. And that's the kind of approach the honourable member should be advocating. This bill is an attack on working people from a party that's bankrolling employer intransigence with public money in the very industry the member's talking about. And I hope the House will reject it this afternoon.